You think you can just waltz in here and demand answers? Avery's voice cut through the factory noise like a blade. His hands trembled as he stared at the young woman before him. Naomi's eyes blazed with defiance. I don't owe you anything. I'm not your daughter. Then why? His voice cracked. Why do you have her exact face? The machinery around them seemed to pause. Workers stopped mid-motion. The billionaire in his $1,000 suit stood face to face with the woman whose calloused hands told stories his money could never buy. Because life is cruel, Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of machines. And some resemblances destroy more than they heal. Welcome back, beautiful souls. If that moment just sent chills down your spine, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now, trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with my global family. To my incredible subscribers, thank you for being here. Your support means everything to me, and I'm grateful for each and every one of you who chooses to spend your precious time with me. Let me say a quick prayer for all of us. Heavenly Father, bless everyone watching this today. Give them strength for whatever battles they're fighting, wisdom for the decisions they're making, and peace in their hearts. Protect their families, their health, and their dreams. Let this day bring them closer to their purpose. Amen. Now, let me take you into a story that will shake you to your core. This is about power, loss, and the dangerous game fate plays with broken hearts. The Grant Industries factory stretched across 12 acres of concrete and steel. Smokestacks pierced the Chicago skyline like gray fingers reaching toward heaven. Inside, the symphony of industry played its relentless tune, metal against metal, hydraulics hissing, conveyor belts carrying their endless cargo. Naomi Brooks moved through this chaos like she belonged there. Her yellow hard hat sat perfectly on her head, safety goggles protecting eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. At 27, her body carried the strength of a woman who had fought for every meal, every shelter, every breath. She hefted a steel beam across her shoulders, 40 pounds of raw metal that would have crushed lesser workers. But Naomi wasn't lesser. She was forged in fires most people couldn't imagine. Brooks. The supervisor's voice boomed across the floor. Move faster. We're behind quota. Naomi didn't respond. She never did. Words were weapons in places like this, and she had learned long ago to keep her arsenal hidden. 3 floors above, behind tinted glass, Avery Grant surveyed his empire. 58 years old, silver threading through hair that had once been black as midnight. His Navy Tom Ford suit cost more than most workers made in 6 months. But money couldn't fill the hollow space in his chest where his heart used to be. He wasn't supposed to be here today. Board meetings usually kept him trapped in corner offices with views of Lake Michigan. But something had pulled him to the factory floor, a restlessness he couldn't name. His assistant, Marcus, shuffled papers behind him. Sir, the quarterly reports show. Later. Avery's eyes scanned the workers below. Dozens of them, moving like ants in their synchronized dance of labor. Then he saw her. Time stopped. The steel beam balanced on her shoulders caught the light, creating a halo effect around her silhouette. But it wasn't the beam that stole his breath, it was her face. The same oval jawline that had smiled at him across breakfast tables 15 years ago. The same deep-set eyes that had rolled dramatically at his dad jokes. Even the way she tilted her head when concentrating, identical to the girl who had vanished from his life like smoke. Sir. Marcus's voice seemed to come from underwater. Are you all right? Avery's knuckles went white against the railing. His daughter would be 28 now. This woman looked exactly that age. The resemblance wasn't similar, it was perfect. Terrifyingly, impossibly perfect. Tell me who that is, he whispered, pointing toward Naomi. Marcus squinted through the glass. Which worker, sir? The woman. Yellow hat. Carrying the beam. Marcus pulled up a tablet, fingers dancing across the screen. Naomi Brooks. Been with us 6 months. Good attendance record, no disciplinary issues. Temporary work visa. Temporary. The word hit Avery like a physical blow. His daughter had been temporary too, there one day, gone the next. He watched Naomi set down the beam, muscles flexing beneath her work shirt. She pulled off her gloves and wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. In that simple gesture, he saw his daughter's ghost. I need to go down there. Sir, the factory floor requires. I own the building, Marcus. Let me ask you something in the comments, have you ever seen someone who looked so much like someone you lost that it actually hurt? Because what happens next will break your heart. Avery descended the metal stairs, each step echoing in his chest. Workers glanced up as he passed, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The billionaire owner walking the floor was like spotting a unicorn, rare, strange, and somehow threatening. Naomi felt his presence before she saw him. The air changed, became electric with tension. When she turned, their eyes met across the industrial wasteland. For a moment, neither breathed. Up close, the resemblance was even more devastating. She had the same freckle above her left eyebrow, the same slight scar on her chin from a childhood accident. Avery's legs nearly gave out. What's your name? His voice came out rougher than intended. Naomi's jaw tightened. She recognized power when she saw it, the way he stood, the way others stepped aside, the way his very presence commanded the room. Men like him meant trouble for women like her. Naomi, she said finally, her accent carrying traces of somewhere else, somewhere harder. Naomi what? Brooks. The name meant nothing to him, but names could be changed. Faces couldn't. And this face was haunting him, calling to every buried grief in his soul. How long have you worked here? 6 months. Her answers were clipped, careful. She'd learned not to volunteer information to men in expensive suits. Where are you from? Naomi's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Everywhere. Nowhere. Does it matter? It was the defiance in her voice that broke him. His daughter had sounded exactly like that when cornered, when pressed for answers she didn't want to give. It matters to me, he whispered. The Grant mansion had been different then. Laughter echoed through marble hallways, Christmas mornings brought chaos and joy, and a teenage girl with wild hair and bigger dreams filled every room with her energy. Zoe Grant had been 17 and invincible. Captain of the debate team, straight-A student, the kind of daughter who made other parents jealous. She and Avery had their fights, what father and daughter didn't. But underneath the typical teenage rebellion was love deeper than any fortune. Dad, I'm going to change the world, she told him the night before she disappeared. They were sitting in his study, city lights twinkling beyond the windows. I know you will, sweetheart. Promise you'll be proud of me, no matter what. It was such an odd question, but teenage girls said odd things. He'd kissed her forehead and promised, never imagining those would be among their last words. The next morning, her bed was empty. No note. No explanation. Just gone. The search had consumed him. Private investigators combed 3 states. The FBI opened a file. Avery plastered her face on billboards from Chicago to California. He offered rewards that made headlines, followed leads that led nowhere, and slowly watched his marriage crumble under the weight of shared grief. His ex-wife, Patricia, had blamed him. She felt trapped by your expectations, she'd screamed during one of their final fights. All that pressure to be perfect. But Avery knew better. Zoe hadn't run from expectations, she'd run toward something. Adventure, maybe. Independence. Or something darker that he couldn't bear to consider. The child support battles had been ugly. Patricia demanded money for a daughter who might not even be alive. When Avery finally cut her off, she'd called him heartless. Maybe he was. Maybe grief had frozen his heart solid. "You remind me of someone," Avery said, his voice barely audible over the machinery. Naomi's eyes hardened. She'd heard that line before, from men who wanted things she wouldn't give. "I remind everyone of someone. It's not special. This is different. They always say that." But something in his tone made her look closer. This wasn't the predatory hunger she'd learned to recognize. This was pain, raw and bleeding, wrapped in an expensive suit. "Who?" she asked despite herself. "Who do I remind you of?" Avery's throat worked. "My daughter." The words hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. "Where is she now?" Naomi's voice was softer than she'd intended. "Gone. 15 years. Dead? I don't know." Naomi studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried invisible weight. She'd seen that look before, in her own mother's face during the worst times. The look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be." He straightened, businessman armor sliding back into place. "Just, be careful who you trust around here." It was a strange thing to say, but before Naomi could ask what he meant, he was walking away, his expensive shoes clicking against concrete like a countdown timer. She watched him go, something unfamiliar twisting in her chest. Pity, maybe. Or recognition, one broken person seeing another across the vast space that separated their worlds. Drop a broken heart in the comments if this moment hit you different. Because what I'm about to tell you next will change everything you think you know about both of them. 10 years earlier, Naomi had been a different person entirely. 17 years old, living in a small apartment in Detroit with dreams bigger than her circumstances. She was going to be a teacher, maybe work with kids who needed someone to believe in them. Then the raids came. It started with rumors, ICE sweeping through neighborhoods, checking papers, asking questions. Naomi had been born in Detroit, was as American as apple pie, but when you were black and living in the wrong zip code, documentation was just paper. The morning they came for her, she was walking to school. 3 black SUVs, men in tactical gear, a scene that looked more like a movie than real life. "Papers," the officer demanded. Naomi fumbled for her student ID, her hands shaking. "I'm American. I was born here. This isn't valid identification. It's my school ID. I can call my mom." "Turn around." The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. Around her, other teenagers were being loaded into buses. Kids she'd grown up with, kids whose only crime was being born with the wrong skin color in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. The detention center had been hell. Hundreds of people crammed into spaces meant for dozens. No privacy, barely any food, and the constant threat of deportation hanging over everyone like a storm cloud. Naomi's mother had tried everything, lawyers, protests, media attention. But 17-year-old black girls from Detroit didn't make headlines, especially when the news cycle was busy with bigger stories. After 6 months, they put her on a bus to Mexico. "But I'm American." She'd screamed as they shoved her across the border. The officer had shrugged. "Prove it from there." Mexico had been a different kind of hell. Naomi spoke some Spanish from high school, but not enough. She was alone, underage, and completely unprepared for the reality of starting over with nothing. The first month, she slept in a church shelter, grateful for a roof and a meal. But charity had limits, and eventually, she had to find work. Sweatshops became her classroom. 16-hour days sewing clothes that would sell for more than she made in a month. Her fingers bled from needle pricks, her back ached from hunching over machines, but she endured because the alternative was starvation. At night, she cleaned restaurants for extra money. Scrubbing floors until 3 a.m., then catching a few hours of sleep before the sweatshop opened. It was a cycle of exhaustion and survival, with no end in sight. The storage room had been rock bottom, literally a closet behind a laundromat where she paid rent to sleep on a mattress that smelled like industrial detergent. But it was hers, and after months of uncertainty, even that small claim felt like victory. Then Zentex Industries had offered her a lifeline. The international manufacturing company needed workers for their U.S. operations. They could forge the papers, arrange temporary work visas, give her a chance to earn real money for the first time in years. The catch? The visa was only good for 6 months. Renewal required a fee that was almost impossible to save, especially when every spare dollar went to her mother's medical bills. Naomi's mother had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 2 years after her daughter's deportation. The irony was crushing. They'd torn the family apart in the name of law and order, then left an American citizen to die slowly because she couldn't afford treatment. Naomi sent money every month, sometimes going without meals to ensure her mother could buy medications. It was a choice between her own future and her mother's life, and really, was that even a choice at all? Now, with her visa expiring in 3 days and her savings account showing $347 against the $2,000 renewal fee, Naomi was facing deportation again. The thought made her physically sick. She'd survived Mexico once as a teenager with nothing to lose. But now she was older, scarred, and carrying the weight of her mother's life on her shoulders. Going back would mean watching her mother die from thousands of miles away. Standing in the factory, watching the billionaire who looked at her like she was a ghost, Naomi felt the walls closing in. Time was running out, options were disappearing, and desperation was making her consider things she'd never imagined. Like accepting help from a man whose eyes held too much pain and too much power for her own good. 3 days passed before Avery returned to the factory floor. 3 days of sleepless nights, staring at old photos of Zoe, wondering if he was losing his mind. But the pull was too strong, the resemblance too perfect to ignore. This time, he didn't watch from above. He walked directly to Naomi's station, where she was operating a metal press, her movements precise despite the machine's violent rhythm. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Naomi didn't look up from her work. "I'm on the clock. I own the clock." That made her pause. She hit the emergency stop, and the machine fell silent. Around them, other workers pretended not to stare, but tension rippled through the air like electricity before a storm. "What do you want?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Answers. I already told you, I'm not your daughter." "Then explain the face. Explain why looking at you feels like looking at a ghost." Naomi's jaw tightened. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that led to questions about documentation, background checks, investigations that could uncover her forged papers. "Genetics are funny," she said carefully. "People look like other people. It doesn't mean anything." But Avery stepped closer, and she could see the desperation burning in his eyes. This wasn't casual curiosity, this was a man drowning, grasping for any lifeline. "My daughter had a birthmark," he said quietly. "Right here." He pointed to a spot on his left shoulder. "Shaped like a crescent moon." Naomi's blood turned to ice. Beneath her work shirt, in the exact spot he'd indicated, was a crescent-shaped birthmark she'd had since birth. But there was no way she was showing him that. "Lots of people have birthmarks," she said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her. "Show me." "Excuse me?" "Show me your shoulder. Prove me wrong." The factory floor suddenly felt too small, too hot. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, workers had stopped even pretending to work, sensing drama unfolding. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said, but she was backing away now, putting distance between them. Avery followed, his eyes locked on hers like a hunter tracking prey. "You're afraid." "I'm not afraid of anything." "Then show me." "No." The word hung between them like a challenge. Avery's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked less like a powerful billionaire and more like a broken father who'd been searching for 15 years. "If you were Naomi, would you trust him?" Comment yes or no below. Because what she does next will determine whether this story ends in salvation or complete destruction. Please, he whispered, and that single word carried the weight of a decade and a half of grief. I just need to know. Naomi looked at him, really looked. She saw the expensive suit, yes, but also the trembling hands. The commanding presence, but also the hollowed-out eyes of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. You're not the first man to claim I look like someone you loved, she said softly. But you might be the most broken. Does that scare you? Everything scares me, she admitted. But broken men scare me most of all. Avery nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. I'll double your salary, he said suddenly. Triple it. Whatever it takes to keep you here, to give me time to. To what? Pretend I'm her. To figure out what this means. Naomi studied his face, weighing options she couldn't afford to consider. Her visa expired in 2 days. Her mother's chemotherapy couldn't wait. And this man, as dangerous as he felt, might be her only way forward. I can't be your daughter, she said finally. I can't fill that hole in your heart. I know. And I won't be bought. I understand. But. She took a shaky breath. I need this job. More than you know. Something shifted in Avery's expression. The desperation softened into something else, not hope exactly, but possibility. Then we understand each other, he said. 15 years earlier, Patricia Grant had been living in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, her closet full of designer clothes, her calendar full of charity galas and spa appointments. The child support checks from Avery had been generous, more than generous. They'd funded a lifestyle most people could only dream of. When Zoe disappeared, Patricia's world tilted sideways. But the money kept coming, a lifeline in the chaos of search parties and police interviews. She told herself it was temporary, that Zoe would come home, that life would return to normal. But months became years, and normal never came back. The divorce proceedings had been brutal. Patricia, consumed with grief and rage, had demanded continued support. She's still alive, she'd insisted to lawyers, to judges, to anyone who would listen. Our daughter is out there, and when she comes home, she'll need everything we can give her. Avery had disagreed. I won't pay for a ghost, he'd said during their final court appearance. The words had cut deeper than any knife. When the payment stopped, Patricia's carefully constructed life began to crumble. The penthouse went first, too expensive without Avery's financial backing. Then the car, the clothes, the memberships to exclusive clubs where appearances mattered more than substance. But Patricia had lived above her means for so long that she'd forgotten how to live any other way. Credit cards became her new lifeline, debt piling upon debt until bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The phone calls from collectors started at dawn and lasted until midnight. Her friends from the charity circuit began avoiding her, whispered conversations dying when she entered rooms. Shame became her constant companion. That's when the real desperation set in. Patricia had always been beautiful, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and command attention. She'd married Avery young, before his empire truly exploded, and sometimes wondered if she'd settled too quickly. Now, approaching 40 with wrinkles creeping around her eyes and creditors breathing down her neck, she began pursuing other wealthy men. Dinners became auditions, conversations became negotiations, and her dignity became currency she couldn't afford to keep. The succession of relationships blurred together, a tech entrepreneur who promised the world and delivered heartbreak, a pharmaceutical executive who wanted a trophy wife but not Patricia's emotional baggage, a real estate mogul who disappeared when he realized she brought debt instead of assets to the table. Each failed relationship drove her deeper into financial ruin and emotional despair. She started drinking more, sleeping less, making increasingly desperate choices. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Grant. The voice was heavily accented, difficult to understand through the static of an international connection. I have information about your daughter. Patricia's hands shook as she gripped the phone. What kind of information? She is alive. In Mexico. I can help you find her, but it will cost money. It was probably a scam, Patricia's rational mind knew that. But rational thought had abandoned her years ago, replaced by a mother's desperate hope and a need for redemption that consumed her from the inside. She mortgaged everything she had left, her small apartment, her car, even her late mother's jewelry. The man on the phone asked for more money, then more, each payment bringing promises of new leads, fresh information, tantalizing possibilities. When her resources finally ran dry, she had nothing left but one last, impossible choice: go to Mexico herself. Patricia's journey south was a descent into a world she'd never imagined. Flying to Tijuana was the easy part, the hard part was everything that came after. She'd hired a guide, a weathered man named Carlos who spoke broken English and carried too many scars for someone who claimed to be in the transportation business. He'd laughed when she'd shown up in heels and a designer purse. Where you think you going, lady? This no vacation. The first border crossing had been through Canada, a circuitous route that Carlos insisted was safer than going directly south. Patricia had never been so terrified in her life, cramped in the back of a van with a dozen other people who spoke languages she didn't recognize. From Canada to the US, then south through Texas into Mexico. Each checkpoint was a gamble, each officer a potential disaster. Patricia's American passport helped, but the questions were always the same: why was she traveling? Where was she going? What was her business? Looking for my daughter, she'd answer truthfully, though the truth sounded insane even to her. Mexico City had been a shock: the poverty, the chaos, the realization that finding one person in a city of millions was like searching for a grain of sand in an ocean. But Patricia pressed on, following leads that led nowhere, chasing rumors that dissolved like smoke. She stayed in hostels that smelled like disinfectant and desperation, ate food that made her sick, and slowly burned through the last of her money. The breakthrough came in Guadalajara, 6 months into her search. A woman at a shelter mentioned seeing someone who matched Zoe's description, younger then, maybe 17 or 18, working at a textile factory on the outskirts of the city. Patricia's heart had nearly stopped. She'd raced to the factory, but the girl was already gone, moved on to another job, another city, another link in a chain of survival that stretched across borders. But it was something. Proof that her daughter had been alive, had been fighting, had been surviving in a world Patricia had never known existed. The trail led her from city to city, Guadalajara to Monterrey, Monterrey to Juarez, always one step behind, always chasing shadows. Patricia aged years and months, her manicured hands becoming calloused, her designer clothes replaced by practical gear that could survive the road. In Juarez, she finally found her. Naomi, though she didn't know that was her daughter's chosen name, was working at a maquiladora, living in a boarding house with 6 other women. She was thin, harder than the girl who'd left Detroit, but unmistakably alive. Patricia had watched from across the street for 3 days, afraid to approach, afraid the mirage would disappear if she moved too quickly. When she finally worked up the courage to cross the road, Naomi had looked at her like she was seeing a ghost. Mom. The reunion had been everything Patricia had dreamed of and nothing like she'd expected. There were tears, yes, but also anger, years of it, built up like sediment in a river. Where were you? Naomi had demanded. Where were you when they put me on that bus? Where were you when I was sleeping in storage rooms and eating 1 meal a day? Patricia had tried to explain, the divorce, the financial ruin, the impossible choice between dignity and desperation. But explanations felt hollow in the face of her daughter's pain. Still, they'd found each other. Against impossible odds, across impossible distances, love had somehow been stronger than circumstance. But pride, Patricia learned, could be stronger than love. She couldn't bring herself to contact Avery, couldn't admit that she'd been wrong about everything. The money, the divorce, the years of bitter silence, it all felt too heavy to carry back across the border. Instead, she'd stayed in Mexico, working whatever job she could find, sending Naomi money when possible, building a relationship from the ashes of their shattered family. When Naomi finally secured papers to return to the United States, Patricia had been proud and terrified in equal measure. Proud that her daughter was strong enough to rebuild her life, terrified that she'd lose her again to a world of opportunities that Patricia couldn't provide. Now, as Naomi faced deportation again and Patricia struggled with her own demons, the past was about to collide with the present in ways neither of them could imagine. Because sometimes, the people who hurt us most are the ones we need to save us. Drop a fire if you think Patricia should swallow her pride and contact Avery. Because what happens next will test every bond these broken people have managed to build. Grab a glass of water and get ready for, where forbidden attraction ignites, family secrets explode, and Avery's obsession with Naomi leads to a confrontation that will leave you breathless. The resemblance isn't coincidence, it's fate, and fate is about to destroy them all. 2 hours after their confrontation on the factory floor, Naomi found herself standing outside Avery's office, her work boots heavy against polished marble. The executive floor felt like another planet, all glass and chrome, silence broken only by the whisper of climate control and distant city traffic. Marcus, Avery's assistant, gestured toward double doors made of what looked like solid walnut. "He's waiting for you." Naomi's palms were slick with sweat. This felt like walking into a trap, but her visa expired tomorrow, and desperation made cowards of everyone. The office was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's skyline, a desk the size of her entire apartment back in Mexico. But it was the walls that stopped her cold. Dozens of photographs, all featuring the same girl at different ages. Birthday parties, school events, family vacations. The girl's face evolved from chubby-cheeked toddler to stunning teenager, but the eyes remained constant. Eyes identical to her own. "Sit," Avery said without looking up from his computer. He was trying to project authority, but she could see the tremor in his fingers as he typed. "I prefer to stand. This isn't a negotiation. Everything's a negotiation." That made him pause. He swiveled his chair to face her, and the afternoon light caught the silver in his hair. Up close, away from the factory noise, she could see exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "You look exactly like my daughter," he said without preamble. Naomi's chest tightened. "You mentioned that. She would be your age now. 27, 28. Genetics are. Don't." His voice cut through her prepared deflection. "Don't give me the genetic speech again. I've been staring at her face for 15 years. I know every freckle, every expression, every way she moved her hands when she was nervous." His eyes dropped to Naomi's fidgeting fingers. Just like that. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Naomi forced herself to meet his gaze. "What do you want from me?" "The truth. I already told you. The truth about who you really are. Where you came from. Why you're here with forged papers and a story that doesn't add up." Naomi's blood turned to ice water. "I don't know what you mean." Avery pulled a manila folder from his desk drawer, his movements deliberate and terrifying. "Naomi Brooks. Born in Detroit 27 years ago to Patricia Collins, unmarried, no father listed on the birth certificate. Disappeared from immigration records when you were 17. He looked up, his eyes laser-focused. "Want to tell me what happened during those missing 10 years? The world tilted sideways. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew everything. I ran a background check the moment I saw you," Avery continued, his voice softer now but no less dangerous. "Took my investigators exactly 6 hours to piece together your real story. The raids, the deportation, the years in Mexico. All of it." Naomi's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair she'd refused moments earlier. "Are you going to turn me in?" "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're going to keep lying to me." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Outside, Chicago hummed with life, people going home to families, to safety, to futures they didn't have to fight for. Naomi envied every single one of them. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered finally. "Start with the truth about your mother." Naomi's head snapped up. "What about her?" "Patricia Collins. She was married once, briefly, to someone with enough money to keep her comfortable. Someone who might have paid child support for a daughter who looked exactly like you." "You're fishing." "I'm connecting dots." Avery leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Patricia Collins became Patricia Grant in 2007. Divorced in 2010 after her stepdaughter disappeared. Child support cut off when the ex-husband decided he wouldn't pay for a ghost. The air left Naomi's lungs in a rush. The room spun, facts rearranging themselves into impossible patterns. Her mother's maiden name. The years that matched. The resemblance that had haunted her entire life. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Is it?" Avery reached across the desk, his fingers brushing against hers as he slid a photograph toward her. A family portrait, him, a woman with honey-colored hair, and a teenage girl who could have been Naomi's twin. "My stepdaughter," he said quietly. "Zoe Grant. She disappeared 3 months after this photo was taken." Naomi stared at the image, her hands shaking. The girl's face was her own, but younger, softer, unmarked by the kind of suffering that carved character into bone. "We're not related," she said, but her voice sounded hollow. "No. But your mother was married to me. You lived in my house for 2 years. You ate breakfast at my table, complained about homework in my living room, told me about boys you had crushes on. I would remember. You were 15 when your mother and I divorced. Trauma has a way of burying memories we can't handle." The world was reshaping itself around her, familiar truths crumbling like sand castles at high tide. She remembered Patricia's drinking, the fights that shook the walls of whatever apartment they were living in. But a mansion? A billionaire stepfather? A life of luxury before everything fell apart? "Even if that's true," she said carefully, "it doesn't change anything. I'm still not your daughter. But you could be." The words hung between them like a loaded gun. Avery's eyes were burning now, desperation bleeding through his corporate armor. "What does that mean?" "It means I haven't felt anything in 15 years. Haven't hoped, haven't dreamed, haven't wanted anything except to find my daughter." His voice cracked. "But looking at you. God help me, Naomi, you make me feel alive again." Their eyes locked across the mahogany desk, and something electric passed between them. Not recognition, something darker, more dangerous. The kind of attraction that destroyed families and ruined lives. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everything about this is wrong." But when he reached across the desk again, she didn't pull away. Their fingers touched, just barely, but the contact sent shockwaves up her arm. "I can help you," he said. "The visa, the money for your mother's treatment, everything. You don't have to fight alone anymore." "What's the price?" "Stay. Let me figure out what this means." "What you mean?" Naomi looked at their joined hands, his smooth and manicured, hers calloused from years of survival. Two different worlds, connected by an impossible twist of fate and a resemblance that defied explanation. "If I stay," she said slowly, "I won't pretend to be her. I know. And I won't be your replacement daughter. I wouldn't ask you to be. Then what would I be?" Avery's thumb traced across her knuckles, a touch so gentle it made her chest ache. "I don't know yet. But I'd like to find out." The weather turned vicious around 6 p.m., as if the sky had been waiting for the most dramatic moment to unleash its fury. Rain hammered against the factory windows like bullets, and thunder shook the building's steel frame. The other workers had fled hours ago, leaving only Naomi and Avery trapped in the administrative wing. "The roads are flooded," Marcus had reported before abandoning ship himself. "Nothing's moving out there until this passes." Now they sat in Avery's office, the only light coming from his desk lamp and the occasional lightning flash that turned the world white for split seconds. The storm had knocked out half the city's power grid, making the factory feel like an island in a hostile ocean. "Tell me about Mexico," Avery said suddenly. They'd been sitting in silence for the better part of an hour, the weight of their earlier conversation still heavy between them. Naomi had pulled her chair around to his side of the desk, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that reminded her of safety. "What about it? The worst day. The one that almost broke you." Naomi hugged her knees to her chest, making herself smaller in the massive leather chair. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I've spent 15 years imagining the worst possible scenarios for Zoe. Maybe hearing about your survival will help me understand hers." Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face in stark black and white. In that moment, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man drowning in his own imagination. "There was a factory fire," she said quietly. "In Guadalajara. I was working the night shift, and something went wrong with the electrical system. The whole building went up like a matchbook. Thunder crashed overhead, as if the storm was providing soundtrack to her memories. I was on the 3rd floor when it started. The stairs were already blocked, smoke filling the hallways. There were maybe 50 of us trapped up there, and we all knew we were going to die." Avery's hands clenched into fists on his desk. "The fire department came, but their ladders couldn't reach us. So we had to jump 3 stories onto concrete, hoping we'd survive the fall better than the flames." "Did you?" "Broke my left arm in 2 places, 3 ribs, and my collarbone. Spent 6 weeks in a hospital I couldn't afford, then another month recovering in that storage room I told you about." She met his eyes. "But I lived. And that night, lying on that concrete with my bones screaming, I promised myself I'd survive whatever came next." "What came next?" "You did." The words slipped out before she could stop them, honest and raw and dangerous. Avery's breath caught, and the space between them suddenly felt charged with more than just the storm's electricity. "Naomi." He started, but she cut him off. Don't say whatever you're about to say, because we both know this is insane." "What's insane?" "This." She gestured between them, at the invisible thread that had been pulling them together since the moment their eyes met. "You looking at me and seeing someone you lost. Me looking at you and seeing someone who might save me. It's not real. Isn't it?" Another lightning flash, and in its brief illumination, she saw something in his face that made her chest tighten. Not desperation this time, something deeper, more genuine. "You don't know me," she whispered. "Then tell me. Tell me who you really are, underneath all the survival and the fear and the walls you've built." The storm raged around them, but inside the office, the world had narrowed to just the 2 of them and the truth that hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. "I'm tired," she said finally. "I'm so damn tired of fighting for everything. Food, shelter, papers, work, hope, it's all been a battle for 10 years. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I wonder what it would be like to just stop fighting. To let someone else carry the weight for a while." "I could do that," Avery said softly. "I could carry it." "Why?" "Because I look like her." "At first, maybe. But not anymore." "Then why?" He was quiet for a long moment, thunder filling the silence. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the rain. "Because when I look at you, I don't see a ghost. I see someone who's been through hell and came out stronger. Someone who sends money to her sick mother even when she's barely surviving herself. Someone who works double shifts and never complains, never asks for special treatment, never expects the world to owe her anything." His hand moved across the desk, fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "I see someone real. Someone who makes me want to be better than the man I've become." Naomi's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. And I see someone who's been alone for so long that he's forgotten what connection feels like. Have I? She reached across the remaining distance, her fingers finding his. This time, the touch didn't feel electric, it felt like coming home. We're both broken, she said. Maybe that's okay. Is it? Instead of answering, Avery stood, pulling her up with him. They were close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. This is dangerous, she breathed. I know. People will say terrible things. I don't care. Your reputation means nothing without someone to share it with. The storm chose that moment to unleash its fury, lightning and thunder arriving simultaneously in a crash that shook the building's foundation. In the strobing light, their faces were illuminated in stark relief, his desperate and hopeful, hers terrified and wanting. Naomi, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She rose on her tiptoes, eliminating the last few inches between them, and for a moment, they existed in perfect suspension, breath mingling, hearts racing, the world holding its breath. Then the lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Would you have revealed your secret in this storm? Let me know. Because what happens next in the darkness will change everything between them. The power outage lasted 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the emergency generators finally kicked in, bathing the office in red emergency lighting, Naomi and Avery were still frozen in that moment of almost connection, neither brave enough to bridge the final gap. I should go, Naomi said, stepping back. The storm. I'll manage. But as she turned toward the door, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. The double shifts, the stress, the emotional whiplash of the past few days, it all crashed down at once. Her knees buckled, and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. She felt herself falling, but instead of hitting the marble floor, strong arms caught her, lifting her against a chest that smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. Naomi. Avery's voice seemed to come from underwater. Stay with me. He carried her to the leather couch in the corner of his office, setting her down with a gentleness that made her heart ache. His hands shook as he checked her pulse, smoothed hair away from her face, searched for signs of serious injury. When did you last eat? He demanded. I don't, yesterday maybe. Jesus Christ. He was already reaching for his phone, dialing numbers with the efficiency of a man used to solving problems with money. I need food delivered to Grant Industries. Now. I don't care about the storm. While he barked orders into the phone, Naomi tried to sit up, but the room spun like a carnival ride. Everything felt surreal, the red emergency lighting, the storm still raging outside, the billionaire who was treating her collapse like a personal crisis. Why do you care? She asked when he hung up. Avery knelt beside the couch, his eyes level with hers. What? Why do you care if I eat, if I'm okay, if I live or die? You've known me for 5 days. Have I though? His voice was softer now, uncertain. Sometimes when I look at you, I feel like I've known you my whole life. And other times. He trailed off. Other times? Other times I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time, and it terrifies me because I don't want to lose that feeling. The honesty in his voice stripped away every defense she'd built. Here was a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, reduced to his knees by a woman who cleaned floors and carried steel beams. This is crazy, she whispered. I know. People will think you've lost your mind. Maybe I have. I'm nobody, Avery. Just another immigrant trying to survive. You're wrong. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that should have been impossible. You're the first person in 15 years who's made me remember what it feels like to hope. Tears she'd been fighting all day finally broke free, sliding down her cheeks in hot tracks. I don't know how to be what you need. I don't need you to be anything except yourself. You don't even know who that is. Then show me. The simplicity of the request broke something inside her. All her life, she'd been performing, the perfect daughter, the grateful immigrant, the strong survivor. But here, in this red-lit office with thunder shaking the walls, she felt permission to just be human. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of trusting you. Of believing this is real. Of what happens when you realize I'm not worth saving." Avery's hand tightened around hers. "You want to know what I realized today?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "For 15 years, I've been dead inside. Going through motions, building wealth I don't enjoy, surrounded by people who only see dollar signs when they look at me." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "But when I saw you on that factory floor, when our eyes met. God, Naomi, you made me feel alive again." The words hung between them like a bridge, and this time, neither of them hesitated to cross it. When their lips met, it wasn't the desperate collision of two broken people seeking solace. It was gentle, tentative, filled with the kind of wonder that comes from finding something precious when you'd stopped believing it existed. The kiss tasted like possibility and danger in equal measure. Like salvation and damnation wrapped in the same breath. When they broke apart, Avery rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. "What happens now?" she whispered. "I don't know. But I know I can't let you go." Outside, the storm began to fade, but inside the office, something new and dangerous had been born. A connection that defied logic, challenged social boundaries, and promised to destroy everyone in its path. Because sometimes, the thing that saves you is the same thing that ruins you. Drop a red heart if you felt that kiss in your soul. The final part of this story will leave you absolutely destroyed. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens when Patricia returns and the truth about their connection finally explodes. The reunion happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the storm that changed everything. Naomi was in Avery's penthouse kitchen, making coffee in a machine that cost more than most people's cars, when the doorman called up. "Ms. Brooks? There's a woman here claiming to be your mother. Says her name is Patricia Grant." The mug slipped from Naomi's fingers, shattering against Italian marble in an explosion of ceramic and caffeine. Behind her, Avery looked up from his laptop, immediately alert to the shift in energy. "Send her up," Naomi said, her voice hollow. "Naomi," Avery started, but she cut him off with a look. This was always going to happen. When the elevator doors opened 15 minutes later, Patricia Grant, stepped into the penthouse like a ghost returning from the dead. She was thinner than Naomi remembered, her honey-colored hair streaked with premature gray, designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once commanded rooms. But her eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, and currently burning with a mixture of shame and defiance that Naomi knew all too well. "Hello, baby," Patricia said, her voice trembling. Naomi stood frozen in the middle of the living room, caught between the urge to run toward her mother and the equally powerful need to run away. 20 feet across the room, Avery had gone rigid, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "Patricia," he said finally, her name a statement of fact rather than greeting. "Avery." She straightened her shoulders, armor sliding into place. "You look good. Rich still suits you. What are you doing here?" "I came for my daughter." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Naomi felt the familiar sensation of being pulled between two gravitational forces, each demanding loyalty she wasn't sure she could give. "Your daughter?" Avery's voice was dangerously quiet. "The one you abandoned when she was deported? The one you never contacted when I was paying child support? That daughter?" Patricia's face flushed red. "Don't you dare lecture me about abandonment. You're the one who cut us off, left us with nothing when Zoe disappeared. Zoe was never your daughter. She was my stepdaughter for 3 years. I raised her while you built your empire. And where were you when she needed you most? Where were you when?" "Stop." Naomi's voice cracked like a whip, silencing both of them mid-argument. "Just stop. Both of you." She looked between them, these two people who had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her mother, beautiful and broken and carrying 15 years of bad decisions like stones in her pockets. Avery, powerful and desperate and looking at her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. "Do you know what it's like," she said quietly, "to spend your entire life caught between other people's wars? To never be allowed to just exist without carrying someone else's pain?" Patricia stepped forward. "Naomi, honey, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why you never told me I had a stepfather? Why you let me believe we were always poor, always struggling, when there was a time we lived in a mansion with a man who would have moved heaven and earth for us? It was complicated. It was selfish." Naomi's voice gained strength, years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. "You were selfish. Both of you." She turned to face Avery, whose face had gone pale. "And you? You knew who I was the moment you saw me, didn't you? You knew I was Patricia's daughter, knew we had history, and you decided to play games instead of being honest." "I wasn't sure." "Bullshit. You ran a background check in 6 hours. You knew exactly who I was and you chose to manipulate the situation instead of just telling me the truth." The penthouse fell silent except for the hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of Chicago traffic 40 floors below. Patricia and Avery avoided each other's eyes, both looking like children caught in a lie. "I spent 10 years thinking I was alone in the world," Naomi continued, her voice breaking. 10 years believing my mother was dead or didn't care enough to find me. 10 years carrying guilt about a stepfather I thought had abandoned us, when the truth was you were both too proud and too scared to fight for what mattered." Tears slipped down Patricia's cheeks. "I looked for you. 4 months, across 3 countries. And then you found me and said nothing about him." Naomi gestured toward Avery. "Even when you knew I was struggling, even when you knew his help could have saved us both, you kept the secret because your pride was more important than my survival." "It wasn't pride," Patricia whispered. "It was shame." "Same difference." Avery cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "What do you want from us, Naomi? How do we fix this?" She looked at him for a long moment, studying the face that had become so familiar over the past 3 weeks. The man who had saved her from deportation, who had held her through nightmares, who had kissed her like she was precious instead of broken. "I want you to stop fighting ghosts," she said finally. "Both of you. I want you to see me, really see me, not as Zoe's replacement or your meal ticket or your second chance at redemption. Just me. Naomi. The woman who survived hell and came out stronger." She moved toward the window, pressing her palm against glass that separated her from a 40-story fall. Behind her reflection, she could see both Patricia and Avery watching her with expressions of mingled hope and terror. "I'm not Zoe," she said without turning around. "I never was. I never will be. And if you can't love the woman I actually am, then all of this," she gestured around the penthouse, "is just another kind of prison." The silence stretched until Patricia spoke, her voice barely audible. "I do love you. The real you. I don't know how to separate who you are from who I failed to protect." "And I," Avery said quietly, "don't know how to separate loving you from grieving her. But I want to learn." Naomi turned back to face them, these two damaged people who had somehow created a family out of loss and lies and desperate hope. "Then we start over," she said. "All of us. No more secrets, no more guilt, no more using each other to fill holes that can't be filled by anyone else." Patricia nodded slowly. "Can you forgive me?" "I'm working on it." "And me?" Avery asked. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, remembering the storm, the kiss, the way he'd carried her like she weighed nothing. "That depends on what happens next." What happened next was messy and complicated and nothing like the fairy tale endings Naomi had stopped believing in years ago. Patricia stayed in Chicago, taking a job at a nonprofit that helped immigrant families navigate the legal system. It wasn't glamorous work, and it paid a fraction of what she'd grown accustomed to during her marriage to Avery, but it was real. It was useful. It was a way of atoning for the years she'd spent thinking only of herself. The conversations between mother and daughter were difficult at first, full of long silences and careful words and the kind of hurt that could only exist between people who loved each other despite everything. But slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild something that resembled a relationship. "I can't give you back those lost years," Patricia said one evening as they sat in a diner that reminded them both of simpler times. "But I can promise you the rest of them. However many we have left." "That's all I ever wanted," Naomi replied. "Just someone who would stay." Avery's journey was different but no less complicated. He stepped back from the company's day-to-day operations, appointing a CEO who could run things without his obsessive micromanagement. For the first time in decades, he had space to breathe, to think, to figure out who he was when he wasn't building empires. He and Naomi moved slowly, carefully, like survivors of separate disasters learning to trust solid ground again. There were setbacks, moments when she would catch him looking at her with Zoe's ghost in his eyes, times when his wealth and power made her feel like a kept woman instead of an equal partner. But there were also breakthroughs. Late-night conversations that lasted until dawn. Quiet mornings when they could just exist together without the weight of their complicated history pressing down on them. Moments when the age difference and the money and the resemblance to his lost daughter all faded away, leaving just two people who had found something real in the wreckage of their separate tragedies. The breakthrough came 6 months after Patricia's return, during a family dinner that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. They were sitting around Avery's dining table, the same table where he'd once eaten alone night after night. Sharing stories and actually laughing together. "You know what I realized today?" Avery said, setting down his wine glass. "We're completely dysfunctional." Patricia snorted with laughter. "Took you 6 months to figure that out?" "I mean it," he continued, but he was smiling. "We're broken. All of us. We've made terrible decisions, hurt each other, carried grudges that should have been buried years ago." "Is there a point to this observation?" Naomi asked, but her eyes were warm with affection. "The point is that we're still here. Still fighting to make this work. And maybe that's what family really is, not the perfect people you're born with, but the broken people who choose to stay." He looked around the table at these two women who had turned his orderly world upside down. Patricia, who had been his wife before becoming his adversary before becoming something like a friend. Naomi, who had been a stranger before becoming an obsession before becoming the woman he loved more than his own life. "Broken, but still family," he said quietly. "Broken, but still family," Patricia echoed, raising her glass. Naomi felt tears prick her eyes as she clinked her glass against theirs. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because she resembled someone else, not because she filled a void, but because she had chosen these people and they had chosen her back. After dinner, Patricia excused herself early, claiming exhaustion but really giving Naomi and Avery the space they still needed to navigate their relationship without an audience. They walked out onto the penthouse balcony, the Chicago skyline glittering before them like a circuit board of dreams. "Do you regret it?" Avery asked, pulling her against his side. "Giving up the simple life for all this complexity?" Naomi considered the question seriously. Simple would have meant deportation, poverty, watching her mother die from a distance. Simple would have meant surviving instead of living, existing instead of thriving. "I regret the pain it took to get here," she said finally. "But I don't regret here. Even with all the baggage I come with." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the city lights. The silver in his hair had spread over the past months, lines deepening around eyes that no longer looked haunted. He was still handsome, still powerful, but most importantly, he was hers. Not because she resembled someone he'd lost, but because they'd built something new from the ashes of their separate destructions. "Especially with all the baggage," she said, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. This kiss was different from that first desperate collision in his office, different from the tentative exploration during the storm. This was the kiss of two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. It tasted like forgiveness and possibility and the kind of love that survives everything life throws at it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Avery rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "Not because you look like her. Not because you filled some void. But because you're you. Stubborn, strong, impossible you." "I love you too," she replied. "Rich, complicated, emotionally unavailable you." They laughed, and the sound carried across the Chicago skyline like a promise. 6 months later, Naomi stood on a stage at a conference for immigrant rights, looking out at an audience of faces that reflected her own journey. Some were hopeful, some desperate, all of them carrying stories that deserve to be heard. "They tell you that success is about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps," she said into the microphone. "But they don't mention that some of us don't have boots. Some of us are starting with nothing but determination and the belief that we deserve better." In the audience, Patricia wiped tears from her eyes, proud of the daughter who had become a voice for the voiceless. Beside her, Avery watched with the expression of a man who had learned that love wasn't about possession but about witnessing someone become who they were always meant to be. "But here's what I learned," Naomi continued, her voice gaining strength. "Money can't heal the wounds that matter most. Power can't fill the holes in your heart. Only truth can do that. Only taking responsibility for your choices, only loving people for who they really are instead of who you need them to be." She found Avery's eyes in the crowd, and he smiled, the real smile she'd fought so hard to earn. "We're all broken," she said. "All of us. But broken doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones who save us. And sometimes, the family you build is stronger than the family you're born with." The applause was thunderous, but Naomi barely heard it. She was thinking about the girl who had been shoved onto a deportation bus 15 years ago, terrified and alone. That girl could never have imagined standing here, speaking truth to power, surrounded by people who loved her not despite her brokenness but because of how she transformed it into strength. After the conference, the three of them went for dinner at that same diner where Naomi and Patricia had begun rebuilding their relationship. It was a deliberate choice, a reminder that happiness didn't require expensive settings, just people willing to show up for each other. "So what's next?" Patricia asked as they shared a piece of pie that was too sweet and too large and absolutely perfect. "More conferences," Naomi said. "More stories. More fighting for people who don't have voices yet." "And us?" Avery asked, his hand finding hers across the table. Naomi looked at him, this man who had saved her and complicated her life in equal measure. They weren't a conventional couple, the age difference, the money, the tangled history with her mother all made for interesting dinner party conversation. But they worked because they'd learned to see each other clearly, without the filters of fantasy or desperation. "Us," she said, "are going to keep being beautifully, perfectly broken together." They drove home through streets that sparkled with possibility, three people who had learned that love wasn't about being complete but about being willing to grow. In the back seat, Patricia dozed against the window, finally at peace with the choices that had brought them here. In the front, Avery and Naomi held hands like teenagers, still amazed that they'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate disasters. The penthouse welcomed them back with its familiar luxury, but it no longer felt like a museum to loneliness. It was home now, filled with laughter and arguments and the kind of messy love that survived everything. As they said goodnight, Patricia to the guest room she'd claimed as her own, Avery and Naomi to the master bedroom where they'd learned to sleep without nightmares, Naomi reflected on the strange mathematics of their situation. They had started as strangers connected by resemblance and circumstance. They had survived as family bound by choice and commitment. It wasn't the ending she'd expected, but it was the one she'd earned. Will you stay quiet, or will you help bring more stories like this to light? Subscribe now. Because there are millions of Naomis out there, people whose stories deserve to be told, whose struggles deserve witnesses, whose triumphs prove that broken doesn't mean defeated. Hit that subscribe button if you believe everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Share this story if you think love is stronger than circumstance. And drop a comment telling me about a time when the people who hurt you became the people who saved you. Because sometimes, the most beautiful families are the ones built from the ashes of the ones that fell apart. Sometimes, the love that lasts is the love that survives everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, broken people can heal each other in ways that perfect people never could. This is why I tell these stories. This is why your support matters. Together, we can shine light on the cracks where hope lives, where love grows, where families are born from choice instead of chance. Don't just watch the story, be part of it. Subscribe, share, and help me bring more truth to light. Because every voice matters, every story counts, and every ending has the power to become someone else's beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Remember, you are not broken. You are breaking open. And that's where the light gets in.